Okay, wise grasshoppers, let's go ahead and take some notes on the first of our institutions from Unit 4, Congress, or the legislative branch. We're going to first look at the structure of Congress. These are just some fun little tidbits for you. Feel free to press pause and read through these. Nice little map of the Capitol. Yet again, there's the Capitol. House chamber on the left, Senate on the right. House chamber is a little bit bigger. And the breakdown of Congress. Okay, so Congress gets its powers and its organization from Article 1, which is by far the longest. And if you recall from James Madison, excuse me, in Federalist Paper 51, he explained to us that Congress would have most of the power. But of course, checks and balances would help to keep them from overexerting themselves. We get a big compromise from the convention in terms of representation. So if I were you on your note-taking guide where it says compromise from the convention and then the colon, I would write representation. That's one of the biggest compromises coming from the Constitutional Convention, how the people will be represented in the new government. So it was the Virginia plan that wanted those states to have more representation. Larger states specifically, Virginia was the most populated at the time. Whereas New Jersey wanted smaller states to have equal representation. They really wanted the new government's Congress to pretty much resemble the Congress of the Articles of Confederation. Obviously, you have two sides wanting two things, so we're going to have to compromise. Thank you, Roger Sherman, for stepping in and proposing what we know and love as a great compromise. Sometimes you might see it referred to as a Connecticut compromise because that's where he was from, but great compromise works for us. And it gives us our bicameral body that we have today, our two houses. The lower house, and I mean lower in terms of qualifications, in terms of perception of power, the lower house is the House of Representatives. Feel free just to write HOR to abbreviate. This is where larger states have more power or more voice, because here the seats are based on population. Then you have the upper house, which is the Senate. And in the Senate, states are represented equally. It's 2 per state. And if you're curious where these terms upper and lower come from, it's Parliament, with the House of Lords as their upper house and the House of Commons as their lower house. Let's compare the two. So we're going to do the House of Representatives on that left column and the Senate on the right. In terms of membership requirements for the House, you must be 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and you must live in the state where you're chosen. Notice I didn't say district where you're chosen, I said state. For the Senate, seeing as though there's less of them, they have more power, it's a little bit of a bigger deal, you have to be a little older. For the Senate, you've got to be 30. A citizen for 9 years, and a resident, again, of the state where you live. For the House of Representatives service, they serve for 2-year terms with no term limit. Senators serve for 6 years, again, no term limit. But only 1/3 of them are ever up for re-election at the same time. It's called a continuous open body. And so you might hear of Georgia's senators being referred to as first, second, or third class when their class is up for, I mean, if you want to even call it graduation, like the class of 2020, you can, but it's when they're up for election. In constituency, the House of Representatives serve constituents based on district. Seats are apportioned to the states by population. And in the House, there's this concept of single member district. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. The constituency for the Senate is kind of different because it's the whole state. I mean, really, feel free to write that. Whole state, entire state. They serve everybody, no matter where they live, no matter where the people live. They are looking out for the state's best interests in the Senate. Organization, the House, because there's so many of them, they have to be more governed by rules. So they are more formally organized. And there's more power to just individual leadership positions. They've got to pick people to be at the, head of the ship. Whereas in the Senate, it is less governed by rules. There's a lot more power to individual members. I mean, heck, there's 100 of them compared to 435 in the House. And so sometimes it can seem more informal, like they don't have, they have unlimited debate, for example. So even though it seems more informal in terms of rules, it's a much bigger deal, and they have more power. The goal of a representative is to be closer to the voters' preferences. And so you might want to write this word inside in the blank space, delegate. Representatives more often embody the role of a delegate, D-E-L-E-G-A-T-E, a person who is there to do what the people want them to do. They are delegated to that task. Whereas the Senate, their goal is to be more insulated from voters' preferences. That's why they're only up for election every 6 years. They can get there and do something that's maybe not popular, but is in the best interest of the state in the long run. And so they more often carry out the role of a trustee, like the word trust and then 2 E's at the end. We'll fill in the miscellaneous here in just a moment. There's some more differences that you're welcome to read about if you have time. Again, more information on the House, the People's Branch. It was the only branch originally elected by voters. They're elected every 2 years, so they're more accountable to the people. And they're a little bit more diverse than the Senate and require more strict structure. Whereas the Senate is more stable, they're insulated, protected from emotions of voters. They're not having to be up for election every 2 years, meaning doing the job for a year and then running for a year. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to the Senate as the billionaires club. They're worth a lot of money. So let's go to miscellaneous under the House. Under the House, these people were directly elected by the people since the Constitution. Whereas the Senate, they were only directly elected following the 17th Amendment. That was during the Progressive era, trying to give more people, regular people, more power. Before that, they were chosen by state legislatures. This is kind of a cool chart, just showing you the makeup of the first federal Congress compared to today. So you can see the orange color is the one from 1789, and the blue is from 2017. So just dated a few years. By the way, the color combination here is just fantastic. All charts should be in orange and blue all the time. So pretty. Auburn, Auburn, Auburn. All right, so you can see here that there's a couple professions that are pretty similar today in terms of representation as they were in 1789, like lawyers, diplomats, doctors. As you can see, soldiers and farmers and clergy used to be represented a lot more than they are now. And what jobs have more representation in Congress now? I hope you saw that it's business or merchant persons, career politicians, and teachers. Just a cool chart there for you. We already know this. Congressional term is 2 years. So a session lasts from January 3rd through December, and then the next one, January through July the 31st. And that's when the session kind of ends. But of course, they can call these office holders back in to meet. So they're currently in session right now. The workday is more often than not Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, building in time for travel to your state. There can be recesses or temporary breaks. You can imagine that there was a recess during the apex of the coronavirus or the early on heights of it. Special sessions can take place outside of regular hours. You don't need to write this down. This is just FYI. A joint session includes both the House and the Senate. We see this at the State of the Union. Oh, look at that. And this is just kind of funny. It shows you the day in the life of a Congress member. Feel free to press pause. Look at that. Okay, so let's look at the politics of elections. And then you're thinking, wow, that politics of elections, isn't that redundant? No, I mean, let's look at the political process of getting these individuals into office. So on your note-taking guide, number 3, congressional districts, the number of seats in the House of Representatives is capped at 435, and it is capped by federal law. And you can see that over time, as the U.S. population has grown, representatives are representing a much larger group than they initially were. I'll give you those exact numbers in a minute. Alrighty, so the boundaries of this. You don't need to write this down. This is just FYI. When I say constituencies, I'm talking about the bodies of voters in an area who elect their representative or senators. So if you live in District 6 in Lassiter District, you are a constituent of District 6 Representative Lucy McBath, okay? I am a constituent of District 11 Representative Barry Loudermilk. And members of the House of Representatives serve in something that is called a single-member district, meaning that the winner takes all. It's a plurality. They don't have to get more than 50% all the time. It gets into tricky stuff when there's runner or runoff elections. Anyway, so single member districts, the winner take all. There is 1 seat for each congressional district, whereas the senators serve a state in staggered election. So you rarely have both Senate seats for the same state up at the same time. What's happening with Georgia, with our state, it's just interesting right now. Oh, such a cool election to vote for in the first time. So there's kind of unequal representation in the Senate, if you think of it this way. California has 2 senators for 39 million people. Wyoming has 2 senators for less than 600,000 people. And this just shows you, this is the representational consequence of the Great Compromise. And this chart shows the number of U.S. residents per senator. And you can see in Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, Alaska, South Dakota, Delaware, Montana, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, Hawaii, Idaho, Nebraska. I'm not going to keep going. There's very few people represented by the 2 senators. Whereas for California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, it's a little bit of a different picture. Okay, so determining representatives. On your note-taking guide, the number of seats that was capped at 435 by federal law in the House was done so by the 1929 Reapportionment Act, okay? The 1929 Reapportionment Act, that's at the bottom of your screen there. Today, each House of Representatives member represents about 709,000 constituents. Now, obviously, following the results of the census that took place this year, that number will change next year. For example, just 30 years ago, it was 1 representative for 576,000 people. Had we kept it as it was under the Constitution, each representative represented 34,000 citizens. If we had kept that pace, we would have over 9,500 people in the House of Representatives today. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Imagine meeting at a high school stadium to conduct the business of the nation. No, nay. That is not how that goes. So we've got to figure out how to determine this number. So this number is determined following the census, which takes place every 10 years. And this is when we do something called a portion. That's when they determine the number of representatives for each state using census data. Here's a cool video to tell you all about it.
We, the people of the United States.
The mandate for the census is right here. Just a few sentences into the Constitution.
Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers.
Apportionment. The dividing of seats in the House of Representatives among the 50 states. But how does it actually work? Since the 1940 census, Congress has used the method of equal proportions, which follows this formula.
A sub n equals P over the square root.
Okay, don't worry about the math. Just think of the formula as an apportioning machine. First, the Constitution calls for each of the 50 states to have at least one seat. So subtract 50 from the current House total of 435, and you have 385 seats left. Next, the apportionment machine ranks the states by population according to the census. Then the machine starts giving out seats. After each seat is distributed, the machine re-ranks the remaining states based on the formula until all seats are distributed. This process ensures that each congressional district from Maryland to California has roughly the same number of people. In 1790, each House member represented only about 34,000 people. In 2000, each member represented on average 647,000 people. Since the first census, the decennial count has been the basis for our representative form of government. And as our country grows, the apportionment process ensures equal representation for all, just like the Founding Fathers planned. Apportionment, another gift from our nation's founders, who transformed the census from a tool of government into a tool of empowerment for the people.
I think this map is really cool and really helpful. This shows apportionment gains and losses after the most recent census in 2010. So you guys can see that we did pretty dang well. We got a seat. That's exciting. But remember, the number is capped at 435. So if we are getting a seat, bringing our number of representatives to 14 rather than 13, that seat that we received, it's got to come from somewhere. So maybe we got it from Louisiana. As you can see, they lost a seat, or maybe Missouri, or maybe Iowa. So, you know, it's always exciting to gain seats and always frustrating to lose seats, because that's people out of a job. It is. Granted, those constituents will never go unserved. District lines will be redrawn. Speaking of, let's talk about that. So redistricting, let's look at the role of the state legislature. I am on the back of page 1. Hopefully you see it. And for number 1, I'm going to write redistricting. And then I'm going to write that states redraw boundaries. States redraw boundaries of electoral districts. That's what it is. States redraw boundaries of electoral districts. Now, this is where something pretty interesting can happen. It's one of my favorite vocabulary terms. This is when gerrymandering can occur. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the intentional use of redistricting to benefit a specific interest or a group of voters. Partisan gerrymandering, as you can imagine, partisan, party, takes place to increase the representation of one party at the expense of the other. So this can be where districts can get packed or where districts can get cracked. If a district is packed, that means you're putting as many, let's just say for this example, minorities in one district as you can. Maybe there's enough minorities to where they could go into 2 districts and 2 districts could elect 2 minority representatives, but instead the people in charge pack all of those individuals in one district to limit their voice to 1. So packing districts can result in majority-minority districts. Or you can crack up groups. Let's say that there's a large block of old, wealthy, white voters, and you want to crack them in half to lessen their influence. That could work too. But gerrymandering came about because of the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, who drew district lines to benefit his party, the Democratic Republicans. And you can see a newspaper called it the gerrymander because it kind of looked like a salamander or a dragon. And that's where the term comes from. There's a fair amount of Supreme Court cases involved when it comes to gerrymandering and redistricting. The first is Baker versus Carr in 1962. Now, this is one of our 15 required court cases, so feel free to do a little star by this, but I'm not going to go too much in depth here, as your classmates are going to do that for us in Unit 3. A little background: Tennessee hadn't redrawn or changed their district boundaries since 1901. So, of course, the state changed big time in the 61 years. And you had some districts that represented 10,000 people and some districts that represented 100,000 people, and that's not fair. So the question is, was drawing congressional districts a political process that should be left to the states? The majority opinion said that states can do this, and Tennessee actually needs to redraw districts with roughly the same number of constituents. So the districts that existed were unconstitutional. Malapportionment is unconstitutional. The idea that you have one district representing a small amount of people and another district representing a ton of people. That doesn't equal out people's voices. So this is where the principle, one man, one vote, comes into play. We should all be equal in our represented voices. Okay? Do me a favor, skip the next one and go to number 3. Shaw versus Reno, 1993. This is another one of your 15 required cases. Draw a little star. So I'm not going to go too much in depth here either. So as you can see, fairly recently, the background here, North Carolina, with approval of the Department of Justice, the DOJ, produced 2 majority-minority districts. So they were 2 districts made up of mostly African-American voters, and a group of white citizens protested, saying that they were being discriminated against. And so the Supreme Court has to determine, do these majority-minority districts violate the Equal Protection Clause? The decision was yes. The North Carolina plan was rejected. The districts were oddly drawn, and guys, wait till you see them. I mean, they are just odd. And race was used to segregate voters into separate districts. Excuse me. I mean, look at that district. That's a district. Seriously, like that is a district. On one of this little stretch here, 160 miles, for one little part, it's no wider than a freeway right-of-way. Odd, huh? Okay, and then going back up to the case in between Baker versus Carr and Shaw versus Reno, Westbury versus Sanders, This case came about 2 years after Baker versus Carr, and it required that congressional districts be compact and contiguous. In other words, you cannot have one district within a district. That's silly. Here we've got an example of redistricting. You can see that the dots are even in each of these squares, yet as we manipulate the lines, we can split up groups and pack groups into other dots. See here, look, there's only two blue dots in this one. So those people will lose their voice is the idea. And yeah, so there you go. Kind of interesting, huh? Little political cartoon for you. The elephant is the symbol of the Republican Party, and the Texas legislature's belt buckle says GOP, which stands for Grand Old Party for the Republican Party. And here's a pretty famous example of gerrymandering. This is the 19th district, or excuse me, this is a district in Illinois. This is District 4. Kind of looks a little odd, doesn't it? Would you call that compact? I would not. Contiguous, perhaps, if the district continues along this stretch of 294, but not really compact. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Okay, so we'll talk about modern gerrymandering cases in class after you watch that film. The incumbency advantage. I need you to know that the incumbent is the person who already inhabits the office. And we're still in the politics of elections, right? So this is kind of like the deals that we don't see and the processes to everything. The incumbent is a person who is already inhabiting the office. So this slide suggests that these individuals have an institutional advantage as the person in office attempting to fend off those challengers in the election. And it is greater in the House because they're up for elections so often. But here's a few examples of things that allow the incumbent to have an advantage over the challenger. They can advertise their experience or their reputation. They can say, look at what I've done these past 2 years. Political action committees donate more to them because they already have an established relationship, and they hope they'll continue to pass laws that benefit that political action committee's viewpoint. They can use what's called the franking privilege. I love this, the franking privilege, which means in the election, if you ever get something in the mail from somebody who is seeking office, they don't have to pay for that if they're in office. It's free use of the mail to communicate with their constituents. But if somebody is challenging them, they have to pay for postage. And guys, postage is expensive. It's very expensive. As is running for office. You can see the average cost to run for the House of Representatives, $500,000. For the Senate, $1.5 million. A lot of money. Name recognition is another thing they have going for them. Not to mention that on the ballot, it will say incumbent after their name. And casework. They're able to use their office where they work to aid constituents with federal services. Let's say that you want something done by your representative. They can have people help them to do that as long as it's in the name of their district or their constituents, even though in actuality it's probably just helping them get reelected. But they could also lose. They could. You know, like if the person in the White House is unpopular, they could go down with the ship if they're a member of the same party. If Congress in that term was seen as lazy or ineffective, they could not get reelected. Scandals might mean they don't get reelected. Bad reputations could mean they don't get reelected. So there are things that present themselves, but more often than not, they're getting reelected. See what I mean? This shows you that in the House of Representatives in 2016, 393 of the 435 sought re-election. 5 lost in the primary, 8 lost in the general, 381 in the general, so 97% of those who were seeking re-election won. 97%. In the Senate, it was 93%. The incumbency advantage, folks. There it is. Let's look at the organization of Congress, understanding the processes of how they go about things, who is in charge, etc. If you're with me, I'm at number 4, Congressional Leadership on your note-taking guide. The majority party is the party with the most seats in each chamber. That should just make perfect sense. They are the ones, so in the in the House of Representatives, it's the Democrats. In the Senate, it's currently the Republicans. The minority party is the party with the second highest number of members. So again, in the House, the minority party is the Republicans. In the Senate, the minority party is the Democrats. And the formal structure of Congress totally revolves around political parties and party leaders, even though political parties are nowhere to be found in the Constitution. But the party leaders work with their members to set goals, choose leaders of committees, assign membership to committees, and to really unify that party message. So they appear as one united front that's going to be harder to mess with and stronger when working together. Let's look at these important individuals. To start with, in the House of Representatives, we have the most important member, which is the Speaker of the House. Currently, that is Nancy Pelosi. And in the little parentheses there, you should write D for Democrat, CA for California. And she's up for re-election every 2 years, just like all the other members of the House. She is not safe. Although, I mean, she's been there for a while, so for all intents and purposes, she is. The Speaker is always selected by the majority party. Their job is to be the presiding officer of the House. They are the head, they are the Speaker, not just in name, but also in job profession and in skill and what they do. They speak on behalf of the U.S. House of Representatives, on behalf of the U.S. House of Representatives. They are second in line of succession to President of the United States. If something happened to the President and the Vice President at the same time, the Speaker of the House would become the President, which would sure be interesting today because she's a different party member, or she's a member of a different party. I swear I can talk, guys, than the President and Vice President. And the Speaker has the power to control the agenda of the House and to decide which bill a committee goes to, and arguably if the bill will even be considered. Other important members of the House, you have the majority party leader, which is currently a guy named Steny Hoyer. He is a Democrat from Maryland. I will never test you on that. You don't need to know that. I know he's a Democrat, though. He leads the Democratic Party since they have the majority in the House. He is essentially the number 2 person in the House of Representatives. And the job of the majority party leader is to support legislation for the party and get it passed. Nancy Pelosi, of course, helps with this, but she's got her hand in a lot of pots, and so that's Steny Hoyer's job. On the other side of the aisle, you have the minority leader. This is currently Kevin McCarthy, who is a Republican from California. And so that means that if the Republicans take control of the House following the 2020 election, that McCarthy would be not necessarily a shoo-in for the next speaker role, but certainly the person in the front. Anybody can run for it. So he's a Republican from California. As a minority party leader, he leads the Republican Party since they are not in power. And his job is to lead opposition to control the majority party. But that's a big job for the majority leader and the minority leader, so they need help. And their help comes in the form of whips. Alrighty? So the majority whip is Jim Clyburn. You might also hear of the whip being referred to as the assistant majority leader, but everybody calls them whips because they're literally there to whip their party members into shape into voting with the party on all matters. So Jim Clyburn, a Democrat from South Carolina, is there to assist the leader, both Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer. He is there to round up votes to ensure he knows which way party members will vote. And he's the head of a large organization of assistant whips. This would be a tough thing to do to keep up with 232 Democrats. Well, 231 besides yourself. The minority leader, the assistant minority leader, or the minority whip, is a man by the name of Steve Scalise. You might have heard his name a few years ago. He was shot in the Congress softball game. He's okay. Steve Scalise, that says Democrat from Maryland. That is wrong. Cross that out. He is a Republican from Louisiana. And his job is to do the same thing as the majority leader, to assist the minority leader, round up votes, etc. And for our own representation, Georgia has 14 districts. We earned a new one from the last census. I do not believe we'll get a new one this census. Lassiter is in District 6, and that is represented by Lucy McBath, who will be seeking re-election for the first time on November the 4th. And she is a Democrat. For a long time, this position was held by a Republican named Tom Price, but President Trump appointed him to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, so his job became vacant. Karen Handel ran for a special election and won against John Ossoff, if you guys remember that. And then Lucy McBath challenged Handel, and she won. And now Handel is challenging McBath again. So, oh boy, here we go. And I thought you might like to see all of Georgia's representatives. There they are. Alrighty, leadership in the Senate. Why don't you take a minute to fill in your chart? Why don't you just pause this screen? Doesn't it just look like President Trump saying, this guy, this guy? All right, leadership in the Senate. The head of the Senate, or actually the official title is President of the Senate, and that is the Vice President. So on your note-taking guide, the President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States, or as we'll call him, the VEP, V-E-E-P. Currently, that is Mike Pence. And his job as President of the Senate is to preside over the Senate or to be president of the Senate, be the head honcho, number one person in charge. However, his power in this position is largely ceremonial. He is only able to break ties in legislation. That's the only time he can vote. Otherwise, the vice president does not vote. And Pence has been able to vote a couple of times since the breakdown in Congress or in the Senate this year has been so close, with a few Republicans crossing party lines, like Susan Collins and Mitt Romney and John McCain before he passed away. So there have been a few times where Pence has been able to cast a very decisive tie-breaking vote. And they're only limited to this position because technically they're not elected as a member of the legislative branch. The vice president is elected as a member of the executive branch, so it makes sense that he cannot and should not have the power to vote otherwise. Next up, for the next powerful person, you have the president pro tempore. And think about what that translates to, y'all. The temporary president, right? The temporary president. Currently, this is Senator Chuck Grassley, who is a Republican from the state of Iowa. The president pro tempore is selected by the majority party. That's why he's a Republican, because the Republicans are in charge of the Senate. And usually they're the most senior member of the Senate, majority party. Senior meaning they're the oldest. Or they've been serving the longest. Sometimes it can be both. But in this case, he's the oldest Republican. If you're wondering why it's not Dianne Feinstein, who's 87, that's because she's a Democrat. So the job of the pro tempore is to preside over the Senate when the vice president is absent. Now, there's a little bit more power in this position than the vice president as president of the Senate, because since the president pro tempore is elected a member of the Senate, they can vote on anything. But really, when it comes down to it, the person who has the most power in the Senate is the majority party leader. So I would write that out to the side. The power in the Senate goes to the majority leader, which is currently Mitch McConnell, who is a Republican from Kentucky. So the majority leader's job is to lead the Republican Party, because they're in power, and to guide legislation. And really, Mitch McConnell is able to do that, determine what bills will even be considered by the Senate and by committee. He can make recommendations to the committee to kill the bill in committee immediately as well. A lot of power in this position. Skip the majority whip for a moment. The minority leader of the Senate, so probably the second most powerful person in the Senate, is a guy named Chuck Schumer. He is a Democrat from New York. And he leads the Democratic Party and the opposition. They also have assistants to help them do their job. For the majority leader, the majority whip is a senator named John Thune from South Dakota. And the minority whip, or the Democratic whip, is Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois. Of course, we need to meet our own senators. Newly appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler, who faces a jungle primary on November the 4th, running against a bunch of other people for her position. And The senior senator for our state, David Perdue, also up for re-election November the 4th. And both Loeffler and Perdue are Republicans. You can read about that later, just other positions in the House and the Senate. Okay, where most of the work gets done is committee. So committees are created to divide the workload of legislating. And guys, it's a ton of work, a ton of work. This is where most of the work of Congress is done. All bills cannot be considered by the whole of the House and the Senate every single time. There's committees and then there's subcommittees that do that job. Membership is determined by party leaders, and it reflects the ratio of party membership in each chamber. So in the House, there will be more Democrats on each committee. In the Senate, there will be more Republicans on each committee. There are more committees in the House purely because there's more members of the House. You've got to kind of spread the love there. But assignment to committee is based on your constituents and, you know, what they specialize in, what matters to them. Your fundraising ability, you know, how much power do you have to bring money to the party, and your party leadership. For example, Lucy McBath in the House of Representatives for District 6, Lassiter's district, serves on the Judiciary Committee in the House and 2 subcommittees on that one, Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security for one, Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law for the other. She also serves on the Committee of Education and Labor, and the subcommittee for that is Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, as well as Workforce Protection. And she serves as the Vice Chair for Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Now there's committee chairpersons. You just heard me say that Lucy McBath is the Vice Chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, but there's committee chairpersons for each committee. And what they do, it's a pretty powerful position. They decide when their committees will meet, which bills they will consider, whether or not to hold public hearings to allow the public to listen to the consideration of the bill, and what witnesses to call. The most important posts, like the biggest deal, head of the committee, are usually awarded based on length of service, how long you've been in that position in Congress. And this is actually called seniority rule. Now this is unwritten, but it's been followed pretty well. And I'm curious what you guys think about it. You're seniors and you think you probably deserve certain privileges purely because of the fact that you're seniors, like minimum day. Some of you would say lunch off campus, or a lot of privileges purely because of the pandemic. But there's some criticisms of seniority rule and some pros. So let's look at the good aspects. One good thing, or one good supportive reason for keeping seniority rule, is that it does allow for more experience. It allows for more experience. People who have been in this position longer, who know the process better, that's helpful. Also, people have bigger networks the longer they've been in a position of power, so that could be helpful. So they have a bigger network, more relationships. You could argue that the older you are, the wiser you are, and chances are if you've been in office for longer, you're older. And another pro, they've been reelected more. So obviously they're doing something right, or their constituents feel as though they are. Now for the cons. This does keep out younger, fresher people and ideas. It could also keep out those who are more qualified. You could just have very stale, old members in there. Strom Thurmond, I think, celebrated his 100th birthday in office. And so he was the head of a committee for a very long time. Somebody who was more qualified could have had that position, but they did not because of seniority rule. And so it does allow for stale ideas or people potentially to stick around. Let's look at types of committees. You have standing committees. Standing committees are permanent. That means they're divided by policy area. This is where most of Congress's work is done. A few examples, you can write these down. The House Ways and Means Committee, it's always been there, it always will be there. The Judiciary Committee, the Budget Committee. These are committees that are permanent, they're not going anywhere. There's 19 in the House and 17 in the Senate. Again, the House needs more because they've got more members. So whereas a representative might serve on 2 committees, a senator might serve on, 3 or 4. Joint committees, this is where they get their name, include members of both chambers. Joint committees include members of both chambers. They can focus public attention on an issue, or they can gather information for Congress. Appropriations is an example of a committee with members of the House and the Senate. Same with budget. Same with judiciary. You could just write down a couple of these if you would like. A conference committee has members of both chambers as well, but it has a very specific purpose and it's temporary. So a conference committee is an example of a joint and select committee. Joint and select committee. I guess I should delete that term also, that's redundant. All right, so when there's differences between a House and Senate version of a bill, because they both consider the bill separately, and it's very possible that they could start with the same thing and wind up with something pretty different. A conference committee will be called to meet to iron out differences and produce a compromise bill. That's what they're doing. Iron out differences and produce a compromise bill. And then there's one bill that they both vote on again, and if they both pass it, then it goes to the president. And then we have select committees. Select committees are temporary. They don't stick around forever. Normally, they really just exist for investigations. The Watergate Select Committee is a good one. The Impeachment Committee for President Trump is an example of a select committee. Okay. These are all the standing committees that existed for the 115th Congress. So that's not the one we're in right now, but the one that we were in. And I don't think the one in right now has changed any. A few pictures of committees at work. This is the Senate Judiciary Committee for Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing. There's a select committee, images from the Watergate Committee. Okay. These are ones I would know. And sorry, I guess Senate Judiciary Committee. I'll come back to that. First, you have the House Rules Committee. Out to the side, you might want to write out also known as, AKA, traffic cop. Because the whole purpose of the House Rules Committee is to manage the flow of bills for action by the full House for scheduling its consideration. Manage the flow of bills. That's all you need to write. There's not one in the Senate because they don't have as much coming in as the House does. So that's going to be Mitch McConnell and his staff that deals with that, managing the flow of bills. Whoopsie daisy. So then the Senate Judiciary Committee, pop back up to number 1. Their job is confirmation investigations and hearings. So confirmation investigations and hearings of judicial appointees. Confirmation investigations and hearings of judicial appointees. So that was the image I showed you with Brett Kavanaugh a moment ago. And the House Ways and Means Committee, Ways and Means, W-A-Y-S, and Means. This is another one I would know if I were you. And this is where all bills for taxation originate, because the Founding Fathers felt it was important that the House be the part of Congress that looked at bills for taxation. Remember, taxation was kind of a big deal to Americans at the onset of the nation. No taxation without representation. In the House of Representatives, were the only part of the federal government that was directly elected by the people. So that's why they have that power. So think about these questions. How is Congress organized to make policy efficiently? And how are they organized to make effective policy? And you know what? That's where we're going to stop. I know I told you to do 6. Don't worry about it. We'll do it together. Okay.